German army major vanished in 1943. 82 years later, his snow-covered bunker was revealed. Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most extraordinary cold case mysteries to emerge from the wreckage of the Second World War. A story so meticulously buried beneath ice, bureaucracy, and deliberate deception that it took over 8 decades for the Earth itself to finally give up its secret. It begins, as so many of these stories do, not with a dramatic announcement in a national newspaper or a breathless press conference, but with something altogether more mundane. A broken water main, a collapsed drainage channel, the kind of infrastructure problem that plagues mountain communities every winter when frost pushes deep into the ground and frozen soil shifts with indifferent geological patience. The date is February 18, 2025. The location, the Dachstein Plateau region of the Salzkammergut in the Upper Austrian Alps, a high-altitude wilderness roughly 11 kilometers northeast of the market town of Hallstatt. This is a landscape of extraordinary, almost theatrical beauty, jagged limestone peaks sheeted in snow, ancient salt mines bored into hillsides that have been worked since the Bronze Age, and beneath it all, a labyrinth of forgotten tunnels and chambers whose full extent no living person has yet mapped. A small municipal work crew from the local township, 3 men and a hydraulic excavator, has been tasked with tracing the source of an unexplained water seepage that has been undermining a service track used by forestry vehicles near the upper ridge above the village of Obertron. The temperature that morning sits at around -14 degrees Celsius, and the light is the flat, shadowless gray of high-altitude winter. The crew chief, a man named Hermann Pfeiffer who has worked the Alpine maintenance circuit for 22 years, is not expecting to find anything unusual. The Upper Salzkammergut is riddled with old salt mining infrastructure, abandoned during the Nazi era or earlier. Encountering a forgotten drainage pipe, a collapsed equipment cache, or even an old storage room is not exceptional. What Pfeiffer's excavator blade encounters at a depth of approximately 1.5 meters below the surface ice pack is not a drainage pipe. The blade strikes a reinforced concrete wall, then a second, then a steel door, a heavy, blast-resistant type used in German military construction during the 1940s, still sealed from the inside, its locking mechanism corroded but intact, a rubber gasket around its frame so perfectly compressed by decades of ice pressure that the interior has remained, incredibly, airtight. Pfeiffer halts excavation immediately. He recognizes the construction style. He has seen photographs of similar structures in the local historical society's archive, small-scale Wehrmacht field fortifications and equipment caches built throughout the Alpine Redoubt region during the final years of the war. He photographs the door with his phone and contacts the Oberösterreichisches Landesmuseum, the Upper Austrian State Museum, in Linz, whose Alpine Archaeology Division maintains an emergency response protocol for exactly this kind of discovery. By noon on the same day, Dr. Katharina Weil, senior field archaeologist with the museum's post-conflict heritage unit, is on her way from Linz with a 2-vehicle team. She arrives at the site at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the winter light is beginning its rapid alpine collapse into darkness. Work continues under floodlights. By 7 in the evening, the entrance chamber of the structure is fully exposed. The bunker, and it is unmistakably a bunker, purpose-built, reinforced, designed for long-term concealment, measures approximately 9 meters by 4 meters in its main chamber, with a narrower secondary room to the rear. The interior is in a state of suspended preservation. Frozen condensation coats the walls in a thin glaze of ice crystals. A folding military-issue field desk stands in the center of the main room, still bearing papers held flat by a Wehrmacht tissue brass paperweight in the shape of an eagle. A steel-framed cot is positioned against the left wall, its canvas rotted away but its structure intact. On the cot, tucked beneath what was once a gray wool blanket reduced to a crumbling textile relic, lies a military greatcoat. Inside the breast pocket of that greatcoat, Dr. Wiles' assistant, a doctoral candidate named Lucas Brandner, extracts a folded document wallet sealed with a leather cord. Inside the wallet, a military pay book, a soldbuch issued to a Wehrmacht officer, a stamped identity photograph, a set of forged civilian papers, and a handwritten letter 4 pages long, dated November 14, 1943. Addressed not to a commanding officer, not to a military authority, but to a woman, a wife, a woman who, according to every official record in existence, was told her husband had been killed in action in Russia in September of 1943. The name on the soldbuch is Major Karl Heinrich Brenner, born April 3, 1904 in Regensburg, Bavaria, 23rd Infantry Division, Army Group Center. Last known position, the Smolensk salient, Soviet Union. Official status, killed in action, September 9, 1943. Body never recovered. But the letter in his pocket tells a different story entirely, and the investigators who spent the next 3 months analyzing what the bunker contained would come to understand that Karl Heinrich Brenner had not died in Russia. He had, with extraordinary precision and cunning, faked his own death. He had walked away from the Eastern Front. He had built himself a new life, and for decades, a snow-covered concrete room in the Austrian Alps had been keeping his secret. If you want to see what investigators found when they opened those sealed documents and began tracing Brenner's impossible journey from the chaos of the Eastern Front to the frozen silence of the Dachstein Plateau and beyond, then hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in Munich or Melbourne, Buenos Aires or Bucharest, welcome. We're going to explore this together, because this story belongs to all of us. To understand what Karl Heinrich Brenner did and why he did it, you first have to understand the man himself, not the abstract military functionary that Wehrmacht personnel files reduce every soldier to, a column of dates, ranks, and unit designations, but the person, the biography behind the soldbuch. Karl Heinrich Brenner was born on April 3, 1904, in a narrow townhouse on Jessen-Tenstrasse in the old quarter of Regensburg, Bavaria, the second of 3 children born to Friedrich Brenner, a civil engineer employed by the Bavarian State Railway Authority, and his wife Margit, née Halsmann, a schoolteacher from a family of Bavarian Protestant intellectuals. The Brenners were comfortable, educated, and deeply provincial in the best sense of the word, attached to their city, their church, their landscape, and their books. Friedrich Brenner had served in the First World War as a supply officer and returned with no medals, no wounds, and an apparently unshakable conviction that organized violence was the province of men who lacked imagination. His son Karl, however, grew up in the fractured, anxious Germany of the Weimar Republic, where the memory of defeat and the grinding humiliation of the Versailles Treaty saturated public life. When Karl enrolled in the University of Munich in 1922 to study engineering, he did so in a city that was already beginning its long, catastrophic romance with political extremism. He was 19 years old when the beer hall putsch shook Munich in November of 1923. He did not participate. He watched. With what his university notebooks describe, they survive in the Bayerisches Hauptstaatsarchiv, the Bavarian State Archive, as a mixture of horror and reluctant fascination. Karl graduated in 1927 with a degree in civil and structural engineering, specializing in tunnel construction and underground infrastructure. He worked for 3 years with a private firm in Munich, then joined the Reichswehr, the German armed forces before their 1935 transformation into the Wehrmacht. As a reserve officer in 1930, drawn by the engineering opportunities the military's expanding construction programs offered, particularly in fortification work, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the engineering corps. His personnel files from this period describe him as technically gifted, precise, methodical, and a notation that recurs more than once, personally reserved but reliable under pressure. In 1933, Karl Heinrich Brenner married Anna Maria Schreber, the 25-year-old daughter of a Passau notary, in a ceremony at the Altkapelle in Regensburg. Their wedding photograph, which would later be found among the bunker documents, shows a tall, lean man with close-cropped dark hair and a formal, almost severe expression, standing beside a small, dark-eyed woman whose smile is broad enough to suggest she is laughing at some private joke no one else in the room is privy to. By all accounts, the marriage was a genuinely happy one. Karl and Anna Maria settled in a rented apartment in Munich's Schwabing district. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born in 1935. Their son, Wilhelm, in 1937. Karl's military career advanced through the late 1930s. He was promoted to Oberleutnant in 1936, then to Hauptmann, captain, in 1939, following the German occupation of Austria. By 1940, he was serving as a fortification engineer with the 23rd Infantry Division, a regular army unit with no SS affiliation, and had been involved in the construction of field defenses in France, Belgium, and subsequently in the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941. Here is where Karl Brenner's story begins to diverge from the ordinary arc of Wehrmacht service. While most officers of his rank and background were consumed entirely by the operational machinery of the war in the East, the supply logistics, the infantry tactics, the endless churning advance and catastrophic retreat, Brenner, according to documents declassified from the Federal Military Archive in Freiburg in 2019, was also undertaking a secondary function. As a fortification specialist, he was periodically detached from frontline duty to assess and sometimes adapt existing Soviet tunnel infrastructure for German use. In this capacity, between 1941 and 1943, he traveled extensively through occupied territories in Belorussia and the western Ukraine, often with small specialist teams operating independently of divisional command. This gave Brenner something that most Wehrmacht officers on the Eastern Front never possessed: knowledge of the terrain in extraordinary geographic depth, familiarity with civilian networks in occupied territories, experience moving through contested zones with minimal escort, and critically, a practical understanding of how underground spaces could be made habitable, invisible, and self-sufficient for extended periods. He was also, by 1942, a man in the process of a profound moral collapse that he had not yet named. The documents in the bunker, including a private journal that runs to nearly 200 pages, written in a meticulous, almost obsessive hand, reveal that Brenner witnessed atrocities during his service in the East that he could neither justify nor expunge from his conscience. He did not commit them. He watched them. He reported nothing. He says so explicitly in the journal. "I am complicit by my silence," he writes on October 3, 1942, outside Vitebsk. "I do not know yet what the weight of that silence will eventually cost me." By this point, Anna Maria and the children had relocated from Munich to Regensburg, moving in with Margit Brenner, Karl's aging mother, after Luftwaffe bombing patterns began to threaten the larger cities. Karl's letters to his wife, the ones that went through official military post, become, from early 1943 onward, carefully coded. Not in any technical cryptographic sense, but in the domestic language of a man who is beginning, consciously or not, to plan for a future that no longer includes the uniform he is wearing. He was promoted to major on March 1, 1943, following the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad in February of that year, a defeat that transformed the Eastern Front from a campaign of conquest into a desperate, grinding struggle for survival. The 23rd Infantry Division, by spring of 1943, was engaged in defensive operations in the Smolensk sector of Army Group Center's front, a landscape of birch forests, frozen rivers, and devastated villages where the German army was being slowly, relentlessly dismantled by Soviet pressure from every direction. Major Karl Heinrich Brenner was 49 years old, a middle-aged engineer caught in a war that had long since stopped resembling anything rational, serving a government he had grown to despise in a conflict he believed was already lost. His mother had died in January of 1943. His wife's letters had become more frightened, more desperate, as Allied bombing intensified over Bavaria. And the men he commanded, a company of engineering troops responsible for field fortification construction and maintenance along a 12-kilometer sector of the line, were dying, one by one, in a war that Brenner's private journal describes, with cold precision, as a mechanism for the systematic destruction of everything Germany once was. He was, in other words, a man with the knowledge, the skills, the motivation, and the slowly crystallizing will to disappear. The official record is brief and blunt, as official records tend to be when they describe inconvenient deaths in inconvenient places. September 9, 1943, 6 a.m., Smolensk Sector, Army Group Center. According to the combat report filed by Oberleutnant Ernst Hardig of the 23rd Infantry Division's Engineering Company, Major Karl Heinrich Brenner left divisional headquarters at approximately 6 in the morning to inspect a section of defensive fortification along the eastern perimeter of the German line, approximately 4 kilometers from the nearest command post. The area was under intermittent Soviet artillery fire. Hardig's report states that Brenner was traveling with a driver, Jeffrader, Private First Class Rudolf Meissner, in a Kubelwagen utility vehicle. The vehicle was struck by an artillery round at approximately 6:45 in the morning. Both men are reported as killed. The vehicle was destroyed. No remains were recovered. Both Brenner and Meissner were listed as killed in action, their presumed deaths officially registered on September 9, 1943. Anna Maria Brenner received the official notification at her mother-in-law's house in Regensburg on September 24, 1943. The notification described her husband as having fallen for the fatherland. It contained no further details. She would not learn the truth, or any version of the truth, for the rest of her life. But the bunker documents, analyzed over 3 months by a team that included forensic document specialists, military historians, and a handwriting analyst contracted by the Austrian Federal Monument Office, tell a profoundly different story. The Private Journal, Volume 3, covering July through November of 1943, provides, for the first time, a first-person account of what actually happened on and around September 9, 1943. The plan had been forming since at least early July of 1943. The journal entries from this period are meticulous, almost clinical. Brenner was not a man given to dramatic flourishes, even in his most private writing. He records with engineering precision the obstacles to be overcome, the resources required, and the sequence of actions necessary to execute what he calls throughout simply the departure. July 14, 1943. Brenner makes contact through an intermediary he identifies in the journal only as the Silesian, a civilian contractor working with German supply units in the rear area, with a loose network of individuals involved in the movement of people and assets away from the Eastern Front. This network, whose full structure investigators would not begin to map until late 2025, appears to have been a hybrid organism, part opportunistic black market operation, part organized resistance network, part simple entrepreneurial escape service for Wehrmacht officers who could pay. The price, in Brenner's case, was substantial. He records having accumulated, over the previous 18 months, approximately 12,000 Reichsmarks in cash, and a quantity of gold, 12 coins, Soviet pre-revolutionary imperial gold 5-ruble pieces obtained through means he does not specify, plus 4 small gold ingots, which he had been concealing in a waterproof steel box buried near the Divisional Engineering Depot. August 3, 1943. Brenner writes that the first phase of the plan is complete. He has obtained, through the Silesians' network, a set of civilian identity documents in the name of one Heinrich Baumann, a structural engineer from Salzburg, born 1905, who had died of typhus in a field hospital near Minsk in 1942. The Baumann documents, a civilian identity card, a professional registration certificate, and a travel permit, are described in the journal as technically impressive. A forensic analysis conducted in April 2025 by document specialist Dr. Petra Hagen at the Institut für Forensische Wissenschaften in Vienna confirms that the Baumann documents found in the bunker are indeed high-quality forgeries, produced on period-authentic paper with period-authentic inks, consistent with production by a skilled document forger operating in the occupied East during 1942 or 1943. August 22, 1943, Brenner briefs Gefreiter Rudolf Meissner. This is the entry that most astonished the investigators when they first read it. Meissner, the driver who supposedly died alongside Brenner in the artillery strike, was not in fact killed. He was complicit. Brenner notes with characteristic brevity that Meissner has agreed to the arrangement in exchange for his own documentation and passage. Meissner, it emerges, was a 23-year-old Bavarian from Landsberg am Lech who had lost his entire immediate family in an Allied bombing raid on Munich in July of 1943. He had nothing to return to. He had every reason to disappear. The plan for September 9th, as the journal reconstructs it, was as follows. The Kubelwagen, which Brenner had been quietly modifying over the previous weeks, removing and replacing components, altering the vehicle identification number, was loaded the night before departure with the hidden gold box, the forged documents, a medical kit, a week's worth of rations, civilian clothing for both men, and a quantity of blank official Wehrmacht forms, some already bearing official stamps obtained, Brenner writes. Through a supply officer whose gambling debts I have recently assisted in resolving. At 6 in the morning of September 9th, Brenner and Meissner departed divisional headquarters exactly as recorded in Hardig's combat report. What the report does not record is that the vehicle did not travel east toward the inspection site. It traveled south. A second vehicle, a decommissioned Soviet truck, obtained through the Silesians network and concealed in a birch thicket approximately 2 kilometers south of the German perimeter, was waiting. Loaded onto this truck, everything from the Kubelwagen. The Kubelwagen itself, now empty of everything but the original Wehrmacht registration papers, was driven by Meissner to a pre-selected location in a known Soviet artillery impact corridor and abandoned there. The artillery had been firing into that sector at irregular intervals for 2 weeks. They did not need to wait long. At approximately 8 in the morning, a Soviet 122 howitzer shell struck an area within 30 meters of the abandoned vehicle. The vehicle caught fire. From a distance, in the smoke and confusion of a frontline sector under intermittent bombardment, a burning Kubelwagen looks exactly like a burning Kubelwagen with 2 men in it. Oberleutnant Hardig, dispatched to investigate when the vehicle failed to return, found a destroyed vehicle in the expected location. He found no identifiable remains, which was not unusual, given the nature of the destruction. He filed his report. The deaths were registered. The families were notified. By 8:15 that morning, Major Karl Heinrich Brenner of the Wehrmacht had ceased to exist. Heinrich Baumann, civilian structural engineer of Salzburg, was traveling south in the back of a Soviet truck driven by a man whose new documents identified him as one Georg Fischer, agricultural worker, born Passau, 1920. The route south was not simple or direct. The journal records 7 distinct waypoints between the departure point near Smolensk and the eventual crossing into the Reich's Austrian territory, a journey that took, in total, 11 days. The first overnight stop was a farmhouse near Mogilov, in occupied Belorussia, operated by a Ukrainian family whose patriarch, a man Brenner identifies only as Vasil, was apparently a practice facilitator of this kind of clandestine movement, accepting payment in food, medicine, or gold, depending on the commodity most needed at the time. Brenner paid in medicine, a supply of sulfa drugs he had accumulated through the divisional medical stores over several months. The second waypoint was a canal barge moored near Brest-Litovsk, at the Polish border. The barge operated legitimate freight runs between the occupied eastern territories and Germany, and was, the journal suggests, one of several such vessels operating under cover of official freight contracts while carrying undeclared human passengers. The barge's captain accepted 1 gold ruble coin per passenger. From Brest-Litovsk, the route moved westward through occupied Poland, overnight stops in Krakow and then Linz in Austria to Vienna, where Brenner and Meissner separated for the first time. Meissner traveled on towards Salzburg and ultimately, according to later evidence, into Switzerland. Brenner remained in Vienna for 4 days, staying in a boarding house in the Favoriton district under the name Baumann, collecting additional documents and making contact with a Vienna-based element of the escape network who provided him with an Austrian civilian ration card and a work authorization permit for the Salzkammergut region, ostensibly as a structural consultant engaged to assess salt mine tunnel stability. And then on September 20, 1943, Heinrich Baumann, structural engineer of Salzburg, arrived by train at Hallstatt station on the Hallstätter Sea. He took a room in a guest house. He ate dinner alone, overlooking the lake. And the following morning, carrying a pack, wearing civilian hiking clothes, he walked into the mountains. He knew exactly what he was looking for, and he knew exactly how to build it. The bunker discovery on February 18, 2025, triggers a chain of investigation that moves with unusual speed, in part because several of the required institutions have established post-conflict heritage investigation protocols, and in part because the quality of the preserved materials is so exceptional that multiple lines of inquiry can proceed simultaneously. Within 72 hours of the initial discovery, the Austrian Federal Monument Office has established formal jurisdiction over the site and its contents. Dr. Katharina Weil has been appointed lead investigator. A forensic team from the Institut für Forensische Wissenschaften in Vienna, the same institution that would later authenticate the forged Baumann documents, arrives at the site on February 21 to begin systematic documentation and extraction of the bunker's contents. The inventory, as documented in the investigation's preliminary report released in June 2025, is extraordinary. Beyond the identity documents and the letter found in the greatcoat, the bunker contains the following: the 3-volume private journal of Karl Heinrich Brenner, running to approximately 500 handwritten pages in total, a set of technical drawings for the bunker's construction, executed with engineering precision on Wehrmacht drafting paper, a metal strongbox containing 9 Imperial Russian gold 5-ruble coins, 2 small gold ingots, and approximately 340 Reichsmarks in paper currency, a collection of 47 personal photographs, many of them depicting a woman and 2 children, later identified as Anna Maria, Elizabeth, and Wilhelm Brenner, a leather document wallet containing 2 complete sets of identity papers in 2 different names, a military-issue field radio in a non-functional state, 14 tins of preserved food, several of which, when later analyzed, proved to date from the 1940s, and a small wooden box containing 3 letters sealed, addressed to AMB, Anna Maria Brenner, and never sent. The first priority for the forensic team is the DNA evidence. The bunker, sealed for over 80 years, has preserved biological material in exceptional condition. Hair samples recovered from the cot's metal frame and from the collar of the greatcoat are subjected to DNA extraction and profiling at the Gerichtsmedizin in Wien, the Vienna Institute of Forensic Medicine, beginning in early March 2025. The analysis, completed on March 14, 2025, produces a complete mitochondrial DNA profile from 4 separate hair samples. This profile is then entered into international forensic genealogy databases, and cross-referenced against genealogical DNA profiles submitted by individuals researching family history. Within 10 days, the system flags a statistically significant match with a DNA profile submitted in 2019 by a woman named Christine Dallman of Hamburg, who identified herself on the genealogy platform as a descendant of the Brenner and Schreiber families of Regensburg, researching her maternal grandfather's wartime service history. Christine Dallman is, the investigation confirms, the granddaughter of Karl Heinrich Brenner, the daughter of Elizabeth Brenner, the older of Brenner's 2 children. Dr. Weil contacts Christine Dallman by telephone on March 26, 2025. The conversation lasts nearly 3 hours. Christine Dallman, 63 years old, a retired schoolteacher, has grown up knowing only that her maternal grandfather was a Wehrmacht officer killed in Russia in 1943. Her mother, Elizabeth, died in 1998 without ever questioning the official account. The DNA match does not, at this stage, tell Dallman that her grandfather survived. It tells her only that material consistent with his DNA has been found in an alpine bunker. But it is enough to initiate a new level of archival investigation, one that Christine Dallman actively participates in over the following months. Parallel to the DNA analysis, forensic document specialist Dr. Petra Hagen has been working through the paper materials. The journal, the identity documents, and the unsent letters all undergo a battery of tests, infrared and ultraviolet spectroscopy to establish ink composition and age, paper fiber analysis to determine period authenticity, handwriting comparison against known examples of Brenner's script from military documents held in the Federal Military Archive in Freiburg, and physical examination of wear patterns, fold lines, and environmental degradation consistent with the bunker's atmospheric history. The results, detailed in Dr. Hagen's forensic report of April 30, 2025, are unambiguous on every point. The journal is authentic. The handwriting matches Brenner's known script across all 3 volumes with a probability the report describes as effectively certain. The paper and ink are consistent with the stated period. The identity documents, both the genuine Soldbuch and the forged Baumann papers, are period authentic and consistent in every technical detail with the narrative in the journal. The handwriting comparison also yields a result that no one anticipated. Among the archival materials retrieved from the Stadtarchiv Regensburg, the Regensburg City Archive, during the parallel archival research phase, investigators locate a collection of personal correspondence belonging to Anna Maria Brenner that was donated to the archive in 2001 by an unknown family member. Within this collection, there are 6 letters from Karl Brenner to his wife, dated between 1940 and 1943, written in his official capacity as a serving officer. These letters, in the careful, measured language of a man aware that military mail was subject to censorship, nevertheless match the handwriting in the bunker journal perfectly. But one letter in the Anna Maria Brenner correspondence is not from the wartime period at all. It is dated January 3, 1948, and it bears a postmark from Innsbruck. It is signed not with a name but with the letter K followed by a series of what appear to be random numbers. When Dr. Hagen applies spectroscopic analysis to this letter, she discovers that the numbers, written in a slightly different ink composition, are not random at all. They are a simple substitution cipher, the kind that can be decoded with a shared key, a key that investigators subsequently deduce was built into a passage of a book that Karl and Anna Maria Brenner had both read during their courtship, Stefan Zweig's Die Welt von Gestern, The World of Yesterday. The book was found in the bunker. Decoded, the numbers in the 1948 letter read, "I am alive and well in the South. E and W are in my heart always. Do not write, destroy this, forgive me." E and W, Elizabeth and Wilhelm. Anna Maria Brenner never destroyed the letter. She filed it in her personal correspondence, where it remained, unrecognized for what it was, for over 50 years, before being donated to the Regensburg Archive in 2001. The investigation now faces a significant expansion of scope. What began as an alpine archaeology case has become a criminal history inquiry, one touching on questions of false death declarations, potential war crimes concealment, and the operation of an organized escape network that moved Wehrmacht personnel out of the Eastern Front and into the Alpine region and beyond during the final years of the war. In May 2025, the investigation is formally expanded to include cooperation with the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, the Dokumentationsarchiv des Österreichischen Widerstands, the Documentation Archive of the Austrian Resistance in Vienna, and at the international level, the Yad Vashem Archive in Jerusalem and the National Archives in Washington, D.C., all of which hold relevant declassified materials from the wartime period. What emerges from this archival expansion is, to use the clinical language Dr. Weil employs in her published investigation report, a picture of considerably greater complexity than initially anticipated. The escape network that Brenner used was not an isolated ad hoc arrangement. It had structure. It had continuity. It had a history that predated Brenner's use of it and a reach that extended far beyond the Eastern Front. The organization that facilitated Karl Brenner's disappearance from the Eastern Front in September of 1943 did not have a formal name. It did not issue membership cards or maintain a central ledger. What it had was a loose, adaptive structure built on personal connections, shared financial interest, and in some of its components, a genuine ideological opposition to the Nazi regime. The investigation team, drawing on declassified Gestapo surveillance files from the Berlin Federal Archive, post-war Allied intelligence reports from the National Archives in Washington, and a collection of private papers donated to the Documentation Archive of the Austrian Resistance in Vienna in 1987 by the widow of a former Austrian resistance operative, reconstructs the network structure with reasonable confidence by July of 2025. The network appears to have had its origins in 1941 or early 1942, emerging in the occupied Eastern territories as a response to several converging pressures. First, the catastrophic treatment of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war by the German occupation administration created, paradoxically, a population of local collaborators willing to assist clandestine escape efforts in exchange for payment or protection. Second, the rapid accumulation of looted wealth, gold, jewelry, currency, artworks, by Wehrmacht and SS personnel in the East created both a need for covert asset transport westward and a financial resource available to fund such transport. Third, a small but organizationally significant cohort of Wehrmacht officers, engineers, and administrative personnel had, by 1942, concluded that Germany would lose the war and were quietly, carefully making contingency arrangements. The figure known in Brenner's journal as the Silesian is identified, through cross-referencing of the journal's descriptive details with Gestapo surveillance records from the Brest-Litovsk region, as one Oskar Kruger, born 1899 in Breslau, modern Wrocław, a former customs official who had been employed by the German occupation administration in the general government territory as a freight logistics coordinator. Kruger's name appears in a 1944 Gestapo surveillance memorandum from the Lublin district office that describes him as a person of interest in connection with unexplained discrepancies in freight manifests on the Brest-Minsk rail corridor, precisely the route Brenner's journal describes. Kruger was arrested by the Gestapo in February 1944. His subsequent fate is recorded in the Gestapo file as transferred to Sachsenhausen for interrogation. He does not appear in any post-war records. He almost certainly died there. But by the time of Kruger's arrest, the network had already transferred its central logistics eastward, or rather, upward. The Austrian Alpine section, the component that deposited Karl Brenner on the Dachstein Plateau, was operated from Vienna by a man the investigation team eventually identifies as Dr. Ferdinand Altmann, a civil engineer employed by the Viennese Municipal Water Authority, who also maintained a position as a surveying consultant to several mining operations in the Salzkammergut region. Altmann's role, as reconstructed from his private papers in the documentation archive, was to identify, prepare, and maintain what he called in his own notes rest stations, concealed habitations in the alpine terrain that could house individuals who needed to remain invisible for extended periods while their onward passage was arranged. The bunker on the Dachstein Plateau was one of these rest stations. The technical drawings found in the bunker, analyzed by structural engineering consultant Andreas Kiefer in June 2025, confirmed that the bunker was designed and built by someone with professional-level underground construction expertise. Kiefer's report notes that the reinforced concrete work, the waterproofing, the ventilation system, a buried pipe running approximately 40 meters through the hillside to a concealed outlet, and the sealed door installation are all consistent with the work of a qualified structural engineer, not a military combat engineer improvising a field fortification, but someone applying civilian tunnel construction techniques to a deliberately concealed residential space. This is consistent with Brenner's professional background. He did not merely use the bunker, he built it. The journal confirms this. Entries from late September and through October of 1943 describe, in painstaking technical detail, the excavation and construction of the space, carried out by Brenner and two unnamed local laborers hired through Altmann's network and paid in gold. The construction took approximately 3 weeks. Brenner occupied the completed bunker on October 19, 1943, and the journal entries from that date forward take on a different character, quieter, more introspective, haunted by the strange stillness of concealment after years of organizational chaos. The network's reach, as the investigation progressively maps it, is sobering. The Altmann documentation, combined with cross-reference materials from Yad Vashem and the Allied Intelligence Archives in Washington, indicates that between 1942 and 1945, the network facilitated the covert movement of an estimated 40 to 60 individuals through the Austrian Alpine Corridor, the majority of them Wehrmacht personnel, some of them former bureaucrats and occupation administrators, and at least 6 individuals who can be identified from Yad Vashem's perpetrator database as having been directly involved in atrocities in the occupied East. The network was not exclusively a means of escaping justice, but for those 6 individuals, that is precisely what it provided. The network also maintained, according to Altmann's papers, connections with the better-known Odessa structure, the organization of former SS members, which had its own, more extensively documented escape infrastructure in the same Alpine region. The geography was not coincidental. The Salzkammergut's ancient salt mine network provided ideal concealment. The Austrian Alpine passes provided routes into Italy and onward to South America. The proximity to the Swiss border provided financial infrastructure through Swiss banking channels. And the region's history as a destination for wealthy German summer visitors provided a ready-made social cover for individuals of educated, German-speaking middle-class background who needed to blend into a community without attracting suspicion. The financial architecture of Brenner's specific case is illuminated by a discovery made in the investigation's 5th week, when archival researcher Dr. Miriam Loeb, working in the Stadtarchiv Salzburg, locates a set of notarial records from 1944 pertaining to the estate of one Heinrich Baumann of Salzburg, the false identity Brenner was using. The records show that Heinrich Baumann opened a private deposit account at a Salzburg bank in January of 1944, depositing an amount the records describe as a quantity of gold coins and small ingots, valued for accounting purposes at approximately 8,000 Reichsmarks. The deposit account remained open and drawing interest in the name of Baumann until 1951, at which point, records show, it was closed and the balance transferred by wire to a bank in Montevideo, Uruguay. The bank transfer to Montevideo in 1951 is the last traceable documentary fingerprint of Karl Heinrich Brenner on European soil. What follows is a careful reconstruction, part forensic, part archival, part genealogical, of a life lived under permanent concealment in the post-war world. The Montevideo connection is significant. Uruguay in the early 1950s was one of several South American nations whose relatively liberal immigration policies and limited cooperation with Allied war crimes investigation bodies made it attractive to European fugitives of various kinds. The better-known destinations, Argentina and Brazil, had larger German expatriate communities and more developed escape network infrastructure. But Uruguay's capital offered anonymity of a different kind. It was cosmopolitan, moderately prosperous, and had no particular tradition of scrutinizing the backgrounds of European immigrants who arrived with professional skills and sufficient capital to establish themselves without drawing on public resources. A Uruguayan national identity document in the name of Heinz Baumann, a slight variant on the Austrian alias, the familiar diminutive of Heinrich, rendering the name more generically German Southern American in character, appears in digitized immigration records from the Archivo General de la Nación in Montevideo, dated March 14, 1952. The document describes the holder as a 47-year-old civil engineer from Salzburg, Austria. The physical description, 1.82 meters in height, dark hair, gray eyes, a vertical scar on the left forearm consistent with Brenner's military medical records, is consistent with available photographs of Brenner from the early 1940s. Heinz Baumann registered as a resident of the Positos neighborhood of Montevideo, a middle-class coastal district popular with European immigrants. He obtained a professional engineering license from the Uruguayan College of Engineers in June 1952, presenting his Austrian qualifications. He worked, according to tax records located by the investigation team's South American research partner, Dr. Rodrigo Ferreira of the Universidad de la República, initially as a junior consultant with a small Montevidean construction firm and later, from 1955, as an independent structural consultant specializing in basement and tunnel construction. An expertise that had obvious practical applications in a city, expanding rapidly on unstable coastal foundations. He did not, apparently, seek out the company of other German expatriates. He did not join the local German cultural associations or attend the German-language church. He maintained, as far as the fragmentary records allow reconstruction, a deliberately low social profile. He had a small circle of colleagues. He rented an apartment on Cal Sarmiento until 1958, when tax records show a property purchase, a modest house in the residential suburb of Carrasco, in the name of Heinz Baumann. The 3 unsent letters found in the bunker provide the most painful dimension of what the investigation gradually illuminates. The letters, addressed to AMB and written between November 1943 and March 1944, are intensely personal documents that the investigation team, in consultation with Christine Dowman, agreed to summarize rather than publish in full. According to Dr. Weil's investigation report, the letters express, in Brenner's characteristic spare but precise prose, profound anguish at the necessity of permanent separation from his family, combined with a clear-eyed acknowledgement that the choice of that separation was his own. He writes of his daughter, Elizabeth, then 8 years old, and his son, Wilhelm, then 6, with the particular ache of a man who understands that he will likely never see them again. He writes of Anna Maria with a formal tenderness that is somehow more devastating than open grief. He never sent the letters. The decision not to send them was presumably a security calculation. Any contact, however carefully rooted, created risk for Anna Maria and the children as well as for himself. The single coded letter that reached Anna Maria in January 1948, discovered in the Regensburg archive, appears to have been sent through an intermediary, possibly Ferdinand Altmann or a successor, and represents what may have been a single, irresistible moment of contact that Brenner subsequently did not repeat. A witness account collected by Dr. Ferreira's team in Montevideo in September 2025 adds a final, poignant fragment. An elderly Uruguayan woman named Elena Vargas, 91 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lived for many years on Cal Sarmiento, remembers a German engineer named Herr Baumann, who lived in the same building for several years in the 1950s. She describes him as a serious, quiet man, very polite, who kept to himself. She remembers seeing him on the building's rooftop terrace on certain evenings, looking northward over the Rio de la Plata. He always had the look, she says, in Dr. Ferreira's transcription of the interview, of a man thinking about somewhere very far away. The Carrasco property purchased in 1958 was sold in 1971. The transaction registered in the name of the estate of Heinz Baumann, deceased. No death record in the name of either Heinz Baumann or any plausible variant has been located in Uruguayan civil registry records for the relevant period, suggesting either that the records were incomplete or that Brenner used yet another identity in his final years. The gap, as Dr. Weil notes carefully in her final report, may represent an irreducible mystery, the trail going cold, as trails do, in the administrative indifference of bureaucracies that never knew whose documents they were filing. The best estimate the investigation team arrives at, based on the combination of age, the 1971 property sale, and the actuarial realities of a man born in 1904, is that Karl Heinrich Brenner died sometime between 1969 and 1973, in Montevideo or its environs, at an age between 65 and 70. He died under a false name, in a country that was not his, without official acknowledgement of who he had been. His wife, Anna Maria, survived the war, raised their 2 children alone in Regensburg, and died in 1979, having, as far as can be determined, told no one about the 1948 coded letter. She kept his secret, whether out of love, fear, or some complicated mixture of both that she carried to her grave. Any serious engagement with the story of Karl Heinrich Brenner must eventually confront what is simultaneously the most straightforward and the most difficult question it poses. What was this man? He was not, on the available evidence, a war criminal in the narrow legal sense. The investigation found no documentation and conducted an exhaustive search of Yad Vashem records, Allied trial transcripts, and Soviet war crimes investigation files, connecting Brenner personally to the commission of atrocities. His engineering work on the Eastern Front involved the construction of defensive fortifications, not the operation of killing facilities. His rank of major was significant but not senior enough to have placed him in strategic command of operations of the kind that generated charges at Nuremberg or in subsequent Allied military tribunals. But the narrow legal definition is not the only relevant framework, and Brenner's own journal does not allow him the comfort of legal technicality. His October 1942 entry, "I am complicit by my silence," is not a man struggling to interpret a morally ambiguous situation. It is a man who witnessed mass murder, understood it for what it was, and did not report it, stop it, or publicly resist it. He served a criminal regime with professional competence until the moment it became personally advantageous to stop doing so. His escape was motivated not by moral courage but by rational self-preservation. The assessment, precise as any engineering calculation, that the war was lost and that remaining would mean death in battle, death in Soviet captivity, or death at the hands of the regime whose crimes he had silently witnessed. This is not an unusual moral profile for a man of his background, generation, and circumstances. It is, in many respects, the defining moral profile of a vast proportion of Germany's educated middle class during the Nazi period. People who were not ideological fanatics, who recognized the nature of what was happening around them, and who chose silence and accommodation because resistance was dangerous and compliance was survivable. The historical literature on this subject is extensive and unsparing. Brenner fits into it precisely. What distinguishes Brenner from the millions of others who made similar choices and subsequently returned to post-war West Germany to build unremarkable civilian lives is that his escape meant he never faced even the limited accountability that the West German denazification process offered. He was not tried. He was not required to disclose his wartime activities to any authority. The official record said he was dead. No one looked for him. The men who died on the Eastern Front while he was constructing his bunker in the Austrian Alps received no more justice from his disappearance than the civilian victims of the occupation whose suffering he had observed and failed to report. Christine Daumann, Brenner's granddaughter, has spoken to the Austrian press twice since the investigation's preliminary findings were published. Her responses reflect a moral complexity that does her considerable credit. She does not excuse her grandfather. She does not pretend the questions his story raises are answerable. "I grew up believing he was a dead hero," she told the Salzburger Nachrichten in July of 2025. "Now I know he was a living coward, or perhaps a living man who was afraid, which is more complicated than either of those things. I think he was both. I think most people would be." The victims whose suffering intersected with Brenner's story, the Soviet civilians and prisoners of war whose fates he witnessed in the occupied East, the families of the soldiers who died fighting a war that Brenner had already privately written off as lost, and the countless others who passed through the same escape network, some of them genuine perpetrators who used the same routes and the same forged documents to escape justice they richly deserved. Those people did not have the engineering knowledge, the financial resources, or the organizational connections to disappear. Their stories did not get alpine bunkers or coded letters or bank accounts in Montevideo. They got mass graves and incomplete records and names that appear in Yad Vasham's database only as footnotes. The escape network itself, whose full scope the investigation has still not completely mapped as of the end of 2025, represents a structural failure of post-war justice that historians have been documenting for decades. The fact that organized infrastructure existed for moving war criminals and their collaborators out of Europe, infrastructure that received, at various points, tacit assistance from elements of the Allied intelligence services who found some former Nazi operatives useful in the emerging Cold War context, is well established in the scholarly literature. Brenner's story does not change that literature. It adds to it. It gives it a face, a journal, and a bunker. There is a version of this story in which Brenner is a figure of dark admiration, the man who outsmarted a system, who planned with extraordinary precision, who survived when survival seemed impossible. That version is not wrong exactly. The planning was extraordinary. The execution was flawless. The engineering was impeccable. The man was, by any measure, formidably capable. But capability in the service of self-preservation, at the cost of accountability for complicity in mass murder, is not a moral achievement. It is an escape from one. And the families who received letters saying their fathers, husbands, and brothers had fallen for the fatherland, families who grieved for ghosts, who built memorials to men who were still alive and walking the streets of Montevideo, deserved better than what Karl Heinrich Brenner's cleverness allowed him to give them. The bunker on the Dachstein Plateau has been preserved. Following the conclusion of the investigation's primary phase in August of 2025, the Austrian Federal Monument Office, in consultation with the municipality of Obertraun and the Oberösterreichisches Landesmuseum, designated the site as a protected historical monument. A small interpretive facility has been established at the edge of the excavation, accessible by the same forestry track where Hermann Pfeiffer's excavator blade first struck the concrete wall on a frozen February morning. The interpretive facility is understated by design. A glass-enclosed walkway allows visitors to view the sealed entrance of the bunker. The steel door, still in place, still sealed, as if time has simply paused at the moment of its opening and is waiting to be told what to do next. Beside the door, a mounted panel carries a photograph of Karl Heinrich Brenner, taken in 1941, in uniform, with the rank of Hauptmann still on his collar. Beside the photograph, a reproduction of the final page of the bunker journal, a page that carries only 2 lines, written, investigators believe, sometime in early 1944, shortly before Brenner departed the bunker for the last time on his journey toward the south. The 2 lines read, "A man who disappears does not stop existing, he only stops being visible." It is not clear whether Brenner intended this as a philosophical observation or a personal justification. Perhaps, for him, there was no meaningful difference between the two. He was, in the end, a man shaped by an era in which the boundaries between survival and complicity, between personal morality and institutional obligation, had been systematically destroyed by forces larger and more terrible than any individual's capacity to resist. That is not an excuse, it is a description. The distinction matters. The investigation that Dr. Katharina Weil and her team conducted, a piece of work that in its scope, its rigor, and its archival reach represents some of the finest post-conflict historical forensics of the past decade, does not resolve every question. The final years in Montevideo remain partially shadowed. The full extent of the escape network remains incompletely mapped. The other identities of the other individuals who passed through Altmann's Alpine rest stations remain, most of them, unknown. There are other bunkers, other caches, other sealed rooms that the mountains of the Salzkammergut may still contain. Christine Daumann visited the site in October 2025, on a morning that the Oberösterreichisches Landesmuseum photographs as part of its public documentation of the investigation's human dimension. She stood for a long time at the glass-enclosed entrance, looking at the steel door. She did not, apparently, speak. Afterward, she told the museum's press officer that the thing that moved her most was not the door or the bunker or the documents or the evidence of her grandfather's extraordinary, deliberate, ultimately selfish survival. It was the photographs. The 47 photographs of Anna Maria, Elizabeth, and Wilhelm, carried from the Eastern Front to the Austrian Alps, carried from the Alps toward Montevideo. And then, in the end, left behind in the bunker, because a man traveling under a false name, walking south into an uncertain future, could not carry photographs of people whose names he could not afford to acknowledge. He left them, and the ice kept them. Stand at the entrance of the Brenner bunker on the Dachstein Plateau on a winter morning, the light flat and pewter gray, the limestone peaks sheeted in snow, the silence of high altitude pressing in from all sides, and you feel, or at least you should feel, the full weight of what this kind of story asks of us. Not just the weight of the past, though that is considerable. The weight of the question the past keeps asking, in every sealed room and frozen document and half-decoded letter. The question of how much our clever arrangements for survival cost the people whose lives intersect with ours, and whether the earth, patient and indifferent, will eventually, always, give those arrangements up. Karl Heinrich Brenner's war ended, by his own calculation, on September 9, 1943, when a burning Kubelwagen in a birch forest outside Smolensk told a story he had carefully written. His death lasted 82 years as a fact in official records, in army files, in a family's inherited grief. And then a broken water main, 3 workmen, and a hydraulic excavator on a frozen service track found the concrete wall. Sometimes the ice keeps secrets for 80 years, sometimes for 100, sometimes perhaps forever. The undiscovered bunkers, the unopened caches, the unread journals of the men who disappeared with such meticulous care that even time hasn't been able to find them yet. How many more are out there, sealed beneath the indifferent snow? How many other steel doors have never been opened? How many other letters, addressed to women who waited their whole lives to understand why, are still waiting in frozen darkness for someone to bring them into the light? That question has no comfortable answer, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Because the day we stop finding the answer uncomfortable is the day we have truly, irreversibly lost the war. Not the one of 1939 to 1945, but the one that never ends, the one we fight every generation, the one for accountability, memory, and the recognition that survival purchased at the price of silence is a debt that compounds with interest for as long as the secret holds. The mountain held Karl Heinrich Brenner's secret for 82 years. It does not seem inclined to apologize for giving it up.